thanks for tuning into this lesson in which I'll be talking about target notes, which are basically just notes that we target or aim for whilst soloing. And when I'm soloing, I quite often like to target key notes from the underlying chord that I'm playing over. In other words, the notes which give that chord its characteristic sound. And for this lesson, I wanted to use a chord sequence that we're all really familiar with, so I'll be basing it around a standard 12-bar blues in the key of A, and all the licks will be based around the first position of the A minor pentatonic scale. So the first chord in a standard blues in A is usually A7, and the notes in that chord are A, C sharp, E, and G. Now the A and E notes, which are the root and the fifth, are not just in an A7 chord, they're also in an A minor chord and an A major chord. So we can certainly use them as target notes and they will always sound pretty good, but they don't actually define what chord we're playing over. But the C sharp note, which is the major third, and the G, which is the flat 7, they are the two notes which really define the sound of the A7 chord. So when I'm soloing over an A7, I'll quite often target a C sharp or G, or possibly both, to really emphasise the fact that I'm playing over an A7 chord. Now if we look at the notes in the A minor pentatonic scale, they are A, C, D, E and G. So an A minor pentatonic has a C note, whereas the A7 chord has a C sharp. And this means that if you use C as a target note over an A7 chord, it will clash with the C sharp in the actual chord and create a bit of tension. And that's a sound we've all heard many, many times before, and it can be really, really effective, especially in a blues context. But if you use the C sharp as a target note, it will have a much sweeter sound because you're targeting a note within the underlying A7 chord. And one of the things that I like to do when I'm soloing over the A7 chord is to sometimes target the C note and sometimes target the C sharp, which means the solo will then hopefully have a nice mix of tension and resolution. So here's the first position of the A minor pentatonic scale, and the C notes are at the 5th fret on the G string and the 8th fret on the top E and low E strings. And the C sharp notes, which aren't actually in the minor pentatonic scale but are in the underlying A7 chord, are at the 6th fret of the G string and the 9th fret of the E strings. And there's also a C sharp at the 4th fret of the A string. So here are a couple of simple licks, and all the notes are from the A minor pentatonic scale except for the C sharps, which I'm adding in and using as target notes. Now some of you might be saying that, well, C sharp is actually in the A major pentatonic scale, so I'm actually mixing the minor and major pentatonics, and that's absolutely true. And in a future lesson I'll be looking at where and when to use a major pentatonic versus a minor, but for this lesson I want us to think of the C sharp as a key note from the underlying A7 chord, which we can sometimes add to the minor pentatonic scale just to give it a slightly sweeter sound. So we've just focused on C sharp as a target note over the A7 chord, but as I mentioned earlier, the other note which gives the A7 chord its characteristic sound is the G note, and G is a note which is already in the minor pentatonic scale. So using G as a target note over an A7 chord can be very effective. And if we incorporate a G as a target note into a lick, which also includes the C sharp note, we get something like this. So just to recap, we're still thinking in terms of A minor pentatonic scale, but for some of the licks over the A7 chord, we're adding in the C sharp note to really emphasise the major tonality of that A7 chord. And we're then targeting the C sharp and the G notes because they're the two notes that give the A7 chord its characteristic bluesy sound. Now, of course, you won't be targeting those two notes in every lick over every A7 chord, but incorporating one or two licks into a solo where you're targeting those two notes can sound really effective. Now let's move on to the second chord in the blues in A, which is usually D7, and the notes in that chord are D, F sharp, A and C. So the note which gives D7 its major tonality is F sharp, and that note isn't in the A minor pentatonic scale, but we can still choose to sometimes include it as a target note when soloing over the D7 chord. And around the first position of the A minor pentatonic scale, F sharp can be found at the 4th fret of the D string and the 7th fret of the B string. So let's try adding the F sharp note to one or two A minor pentatonic licks over the D7 chord. And if you've watched any of my other videos, you'll know that I like to add in a few chromatic notes to some licks. So over the D7 chord, let's try adding a chromatic run from A down to F sharp. So the other note which defines the characteristic sound of a D7 chord is the flat 7, which is the C note, and C is a note which is already in the A minor pentatonic scale. So let's try a couple of licks which highlight the F sharp and the C notes over a D7 chord. And now let's move on to the last chord in the blues in A, which is E7, and the notes in that chord are E, G sharp, B and D. So the note which gives E7 its major tonality is G sharp, and that note isn't in the A minor pentatonic scale, but we can still add it in as a target note when soloing over the E7 chord. And around the first position of the A minor pentatonic scale, G sharp can be found at the 6th fret of the D string and the 4th fret of the high E and low E strings. So let's try adding the G sharp note to an A minor pentatonic lick over the E7 chord. And the other note which defines the characteristic sound of the 7 chord is the flat 7, which is the D note. So let's try a lick which highlights both the G sharp and the D notes over an E7 chord. Okay, so we've covered quite a lot of information there, so let's have a quick recap on what we set out to achieve and how we did it. Well, we started out with a basic blues chord sequence in A, which has the chords A7, D7 and E7, and we found out that the two notes which give dominant 7th chords their characteristic sound are the major third and the flat 7, so they would be key target notes when soloing over dominant chords. Now the A minor pentatonic scale includes the flat 7 note from each of those underlying chords, but it doesn't include the major third. So we found where those notes were around the first position of the A minor pentatonic scale, and then we worked out a few licks which incorporated both the major third in each chord and also the flat 7. So for this lesson, I've very deliberately only shown examples using notes around the first position of the A minor pentatonic scale, but of course all the ideas and licks that I've shown today can also be played in all positions of the minor pentatonic scale. So I really hope you found this lesson useful, and if you have, please like and subscribe to my channel. And in the next lesson we'll be taking this concept of target notes a stage further. So please tune in for that as and when it's available. Thanks again for watching, really appreciate it, and see you next time.